Not quietly, not under his breath. Out loud, with the full weight of a man who genuinely felt bad about it, Kale Morrow stood in the middle of the grandest corridor in the Thessari imperial palace and said, "My bad," to a column of carved black stone that had been standing there for 400 years and had never, in all that time, been apologized to by anything. I watched him do it. I had watched him do things like this for 17 days. I had not yet found a way to explain it. The corridor was 300 feet long and wide enough to land a mid-class cruiser. The ceiling was so high that the architects had carved clouds into it, just to give the eye somewhere to rest. Every surface was polished to a finish that reflected you back at yourself in a way that was meant to remind you of your own smallness. 14 of my mother's household guard lined the walls in full ceremonial armor, still as cut stone, eyes forward, expressions carved from the same material as the pillars. Kale looked at all of this and put his hands in his jacket pockets. His jacket. He had ironed it with his hands. I could see the places where his palms had pressed the fabric flat, which was not quite the same as flat. He was wearing his infantry boots because they were the only shoes he had, and they made a sound on the palace floor that no boot had ever made here before, a practical, unhurried sound. The sound of a person who was walking because he needed to get somewhere, not because he was being watched. He was always being watched now. The guards did not move, but their eyes did, which among my people is the equivalent of pointing and making noise. I had known these guards for most of my life. I had never seen their eyes move before. "Is it always this quiet?" Kale asked. He was not whispering. He had asked me during our 17 days together why my people whispered in large spaces, and I had explained that volume is considered a sign of desperation among the Thessari, that the less you need to be heard, the more softly you speak. He had considered this and said, "Well, shoot," which I had since learned was his way of filing a piece of information away under interesting but not applicable to me personally. "Yes," I said. "And your mom is at the end of this hall." "The Empress is in the throne room, yes." He nodded. He looked at the corridor like a man calculating whether he had packed enough supplies for the journey. Then he started walking. I walked beside him. This was already a deviation from protocol. A guest of the crown should walk 2 steps behind the princess, slightly to the left, hands visible. Kale walked next to me because the corridor was wide enough and because walking behind people made him feel, in his words, like I'm being escorted to something bad. I had not corrected him. The something at the end of this corridor was not exactly bad. It was, however, my mother. The guard's eyes tracked us in perfect synchronization. I became aware, somewhere around the 200th foot of corridor, that I was walking faster than protocol allowed. Not running, but faster. My robes do not make a sound when I move at the correct pace. They were making a sound. I slowed. Kale slowed with me, without being told, without asking why, the way he did everything, calibrating to the people around him with a quiet, automatic attention that his species seemed to produce without training, without ceremony, without any apparent awareness that it was a remarkable thing to do. "Are you okay?" he asked. I said yes. He said okay, and he did not ask again, and that was somehow worse because it meant he had heard the thing underneath the yes and had decided to let me keep it. I had been trying to explain Kale Morrow to myself since the second day in the dark, when I had stopped waiting for a military unit to come through the door, and had started understanding that this one man, in this one jacket, with his practical boots and his inexhaustible willingness to talk about a river near his house, was the whole of the rescue. I had not managed to explain him yet. My mother had been sent the report. Distances, tactical designations, enemy classification, outcome. The report was accurate and it contained no useful information. It said nothing about the talking. It said nothing about the way he had kept his voice steady on day 11 when I could hear in the back of it that he was not, in any internal sense, steady at all. It said nothing about the dark, or what the dark does to a person, or what another person's voice does to the dark. 17 days. That was all I had given the court. They had recorded it. They had moved on to logistics. I had not moved on. I was not sure I knew how. We were close enough to the throne room doors now that I could see the gold seam where they met in the middle. 2 more guards flanked them, larger than the hallway guards, their armor a deeper shade, their stillness absolute in the way that only the most senior palace soldiers could hold. They looked at Kale. Kale looked at them. "Hey," he said. Neither guard responded. This was correct. This was protocol. This was also the first time in my memory that someone had said hey to the threshold guards, and I found, to my private alarm, that I wanted them to say something back. They did not. Kale turned to me. "Is your mom gonna hate me?" I looked at the doors. The honest answer was complicated in ways that I did not have time to translate. My mother did not hate things. My mother assessed things. She would assess Kale against every category she had built across a lifetime of ruling 30 star systems and 3 tributary civilizations, and when none of those categories fit, because none of them would, she would build a new one. What she would call that category, and what she would do with it after, I could not predict. I said nothing. Kale looked at my face. He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was adding a piece of information to a list he was already holding. "Got it," he said. The doors opened. The throne room was a place built to make you feel like the smallest thing that had ever stood inside it. This was intentional. The Thessari Empire did not achieve its reach through armies alone. It achieved it through architecture and silence and the understanding, produced in every visiting dignitary, that they were a small parenthesis in a very long sentence. It worked on almost everyone. Kale walked in and looked up at the ceiling the way a person looks at a good sky. The Empress was at the far end of the room, which meant she was very far away, which was also intentional. She sat on the receiving throne, not the war throne, not the judgment throne, the receiving one, which meant she had decided already what this meeting was. A reception. A presentation. She was going to look at what I had brought home. I kept my pace correct. I kept my hands still. I kept my face in the neutral arrangement that the court had spent 12 years teaching me, and I watched my mother across the length of the throne room, and I thought, with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable, she is going to see him, and I do not know what she will see. Beside me, Kale put his hands back in his pockets. He was looking at the Empress the way he looked at things that required his full attention, direct, quiet, not afraid exactly, but not pretending either. He had told me once that he was bad at pretending. I had believed him immediately. The distance closed. The ceiling pressed down with its carved clouds and its gold inlay and its 1,000 years of weight. The guards along the walls did not breathe. We stopped at the correct distance. I performed the greeting. I did it correctly. My mother looked at Kale. Kale looked at my mother. The Empress of the Thessari Dominion, ruler of 30 star systems, mother of 3 and grandmother of 7, a woman whose stillness could silence a war council, looked at this one human in his hand-iron jacket and his practical boots, and she was, I realized, recalibrating. Something in her face changed by the width of a single degree. Kale, into the silence, said, "Ma'am." The throne room held. I thought about the corridor. I thought about the pillar he had apologized to, and the guards whose eyes had moved, and the 14 times I had rehearsed this walk in the 3 days since we had been back, and the way I was standing right now with my hands completely still, because I had learned in 17 days that stillness was not always the same thing as calm. And sometimes calm looked like a man with his hands in his pockets saying ma'am to the most powerful person in the known galaxy. My mother said nothing yet, but she had not looked away. And for my mother, that was already something. The first thing she did was circle him. Not ceremonially, not with the slow, deliberate orbit of a ruler making a point about power. She stepped down from the receiving throne, which was itself unusual enough that I heard one of the senior attendants draw a breath, and she walked to him, and she began to move around him the way a person moves around something they have read about, but do not yet believe is real. Cale stood still. He did not turn to follow her with his eyes, which I knew was an enormous act of self-discipline disguised as casualness, because I had seen him over 17 days and I knew the particular quality of his stillness. He was paying attention to everything. My mother completed the circle. She stopped in front of him. She was taller than him by a Thessari head length, which among my people would have meant something about authority and presence. Cale appeared not to have received that information. He was standing the way he always stood, shoulders easy, weight on both feet, not quite square, a posture that had no tactical vocabulary but communicated somehow, a man who had already decided he was allowed to be here. The court was completely silent. The Empress said in High Thessari to no one in particular, "He is small." This was not an insult. It was an observation, delivered with the same precision she applied to everything, a statement of data. Cale, who did not speak High Thessari, said, "I don't know what that means, but okay." My mother looked at me. I said carefully, "She noted your stature." Cale said, "Yeah, I get that a lot here." He looked around at the assembled court, at the guards, at the attendants in their robes. He was the shortest person in the room by a significant margin. Is that going to be a problem? My mother, whose understanding of human dialect was, I was discovering, considerably more extensive than she had indicated in any prior briefing, said, in clear and measured English, "It is a question." Cale blinked. This was the first time I had seen him blink at something. "You speak my language," he said. "I speak 41 languages," she said. "Yours was added 11 years ago when your species first crossed into map space. It seemed prudent." Cale considered this. "Huh," he said. "Okay." "You are not frightened," she said. It was not a question. It was the second observation, delivered in the same tone as the first, the tone of a woman assembling a list. "Ma'am," Cale said, with the particular patience of a man explaining something he had explained before, "I have been afraid since roughly last Tuesday. I've just stopped letting it drive." The throne room had 53 people in it. I know because I counted them once, during a ceremony when I was young and bored. 53 people, and in this moment every one of them was holding still in a way that was different from the trained stillness of protocol, the held-breath stillness of an audience. My mother said, "Tuesday." "It's a day," Cale said. "We have 7 of them, they cycle." I am aware of the human weekly system. "Right, sorry, obviously." The corner of my mother's mouth moved by a fraction of a degree. No one in the court would have caught it. I caught it because I had been watching my mother's face for 23 years, learning the language of it the way you learn any language that does not write itself down. She was, beneath the assessment, interested. I did not know whether to be relieved or more worried. With my mother, interested was a category that had produced outcomes across a very wide range. She turned from him then, not dismissively, the way you turn from something you have finished with, but the way you turn from something you need a moment to process. She moved back toward the throne with the unhurried pace that I had understood since childhood as her thinking walk. The court exhaled in a coordinated, unconscious way. Cale looked at me. His expression said, "Is this going well?" I looked back at him. My expression said, "I genuinely cannot tell." He nodded, filed it. My mother reached the throne and did not sit. She stood beside it, which was a posture I did not have a full precedent for. Standing beside the throne instead of on it meant something, but I had not seen it enough times to decode it with certainty. She looked at Cale from that distance. "There will be a formal accounting," she said. "My daughter will present the record of the incident before the full court. This is required." "Yes, ma'am." "After which I will have questions." "Sure." She paused. In my mother, pauses were units of communication. This one was 3 seconds, which in Thesauri formal register is equivalent to saying, "What I am about to say is not a formality." "You will answer them honestly," she said. Cale met her eyes across the length of the throne room without any apparent difficulty. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and there was nothing performative in it, no shaping of the words to fit the room. He was just telling her the truth about what he would do. My mother looked at him for a moment longer. "Good," she said. Then she sat. And I stood there, in the middle of the throne room I had grown up in, and I looked at the man beside me who had apologized to a pillar 40 minutes ago, and said hey to the threshold guards, and stood still while my mother orbited him like a geologist studying a rock formation that had no business existing. And I understood, with a clarity I had not expected, that this was going to be one of the most important days of my life. I was not sure I had the right words for any of it. The formal presentation began. In Thesauri Imperial Protocol, the formal accounting of a significant incident is a specific kind of performance. It is not a conversation. It is a record. You stand in the center of the receiving floor, and you speak to the court as a body, and you are precise, and you do not deviate, because the words become the official history, and the official history becomes the truth by the weight of everyone who hears it. I had done this 3 times before. A diplomatic incident at 14, a border reclassification at 18, a treaty presentation at 20. I had never done it while someone I cared about was sitting 10 feet to my left, watching me turn him into a document. I began. Tactical designation, contested extraction zone Parath Reach Sector 7. Duration, 17 standard days. Enemy classification, 3-tier armed occupying force, non-affiliated with any treaty structure operating under resource extraction mandate. Outcome, full extraction, 0 permanent casualties, return to Thesauri space confirmed. The words were correct. They had been reviewed and approved by 3 separate administrative departments. They said everything that needed to be said for the record. They said nothing. I watched Cale from the corner of my eye while I spoke. He was sitting in the guest position, which for a human meant a chair that was about 8 inches too tall for him, so his feet were not quite reaching the floor, which he was handling with a composure that I found, involuntarily, a little funny and also a little painful. He was listening to me recite the official version of 17 days, and his face was very careful and very still. He looked like a man being described accurately and incorrectly at the same time. I kept going. Perimeter assessment confirmed hostile coverage of all 3 primary exit routes. Alternate route identification undertaken by the human asset over a period of 48 hours. Navigation of the secondary route required. I stopped. The room was quiet. I had not planned to stop. The next sentence was already in my mouth, the correct sentence, the documented sentence, about the navigation of the secondary route requiring 11 hours of continuous movement through compromised terrain. I stopped anyway. 53 people in the room. My mother on her throne. Cale in the chair with his feet not quite touching the floor, watching me with an expression that was carefully not asking me anything. I said, I need to step outside the record for a moment. The senior court attendant made a sound, not a word, a sound, the sound of a person watching protocol develop a fracture line. I looked at my mother. My mother looked at me, 3 seconds. She said, proceed. I turned back to the court. I found Cale's face. I said in plain speech, not high thesauri, not the formal register, just words. He talked to me. The room did not move. For 17 days, in the dark, every day for hours he talked to me, about nothing, about his dog. He has a dog named Pepper and she is mostly brown and she steals his socks from the laundry. And I know this because on the 4th day in the dark I was starting to go very quiet in the way that is not calm, and he noticed, and he started talking. He talked about the river near his house. He talked about what the water sounds like in autumn when the leaves collect along the banks. He talked about his grandmother's kitchen and what it smelled like and the specific yellow of the curtains. He just kept the world alive for me. He kept the sound of it going until I could remember why I wanted to be in it. No one was breathing. I did not look at my mother. I looked at Cale. He was looking back at me with the expression of a man being handed something he had not known he put down, and he said, quietly, entirely out of protocol, "You didn't have to say all that." I said, "You didn't have to stay." The court had no framework for this. I could feel them, all around me, reaching for a category and finding that the shelf was empty. This was not a formal accounting. This was not a diplomatic presentation. This was not a ceremony or a treaty or a political record. It was just the truth, standing in the middle of a room that had not been built to hold it. My mother said nothing. She had not moved. But I looked at her then, finally, and she was looking at Cale, and the thing in her face was not assessment anymore. I was not sure what to call it. She said into the silence to the whole room, "Everyone leave." The room emptied. It took 90 seconds. Senior attendants, household guard, court officials, administrative staff, all of them moved in the organized, unhurried way of people who have been trained to respond to this command, and who are, underneath the training, extremely curious about the reason for it. The doors closed. The three of us were alone. My mother stepped down from the throne. She crossed the room to a different position, not the place she had circled Cale before, but closer, a conversation distance, something I had rarely seen from her in any room with guests. She looked at Cale for a long moment. Then she said, "I have 3 questions." Cale had his hands in his pockets again. He said, "Okay." "Why did you stay?" The room was enormous and empty, and the question sat in it like a stone dropped in still water. Cale looked at her. He was not performing the thinking. He was actually thinking, but not for long, because this was not a complicated question for him. I had understood that about him on day 3, that the things which were complicated for most people were simple for him, and the things that were simple for most people were occasionally things he had no useful response to at all. He said, "I don't leave people." My mother waited. He did not add anything. She said, "That is the complete answer." "Yes, ma'am." She absorbed this. 3 seconds, 4. "Second question," she said, "what do you want?" Cale blinked once. The question had, I could see, genuinely surprised him, not because it was threatening, but because no one had asked him since we had arrived back in Thesauri space, and the palace machinery had taken over, and he had been moved from room to room with the polite efficiency of a system processing something it did not have a file for. He said, "To go home, ma'am. I've been gone a long time. My dog's staying with a neighbor and I think about it. She doesn't do well with change." My mother said, "Pepper." Cale's expression did something that I had not seen before, a brief, unguarded thing. The expression of a person caught caring about something they had assumed was too small to be worth mentioning to royalty. "Yeah," he said, "Pepper." My mother said, "A mostly brown dog." "She's got some white on one ear, but mostly brown." "Yes, ma'am." My mother looked at him for a long moment, and I watched her face and I thought, she is filing this. Every word, every detail. The dog's color and the neighbor and the word home and the way he said, "I don't leave people," with no additional explanation, because for him the sentence was already complete. Then she said, "Third question." Cale waited. She said, "My daughter does not fidget. She has not fidgeted since she was 4 years old. The court spent 2 years correcting it out of her." She paused. "She fidgets now." Another pause. "You did that." It was not a question. I had known, when she said third question, that it was not going to be a question. My mother asked questions when she needed information. She made statements when she had already assembled all the information and had arrived at a conclusion, and the conclusion was the kind that needed to be said out loud to be real. The conclusion was, something had changed in her daughter, and this man was the reason, and the change was not something she would reverse. She said, "Thank you." Cale stood there in the empty throne room with my mother's gratitude on him like weather, and I watched him search for what to do with it. He was a man who did things. He was not a man who was thanked by empresses for doing them. The two did not seem to live in the same part of his mind. He said, "Well, shoot." My mother looked at him for 2 more seconds. Then she turned to me. "He will have passage home within the day. Full escort, safe corridor, Thessari flag for the duration of transit." "Yes," I said. "He will have a designation. The administrative office is preparing the formal title." "Yes." She started toward the far door, the private door, the one that led back to her chambers and her councils, and the 30-star systems of work that waited for her regardless of what happened in this room. She stopped, one hand on the door, her back to us. She said to the room, to herself, or perhaps to the record, "Do not make an enemy of their kind. They are small and they do not leave people." A pause. That combination ends empires. The door closed. I stood in the throne room with Cale, in the quiet she had left behind, and I did not speak for a long moment, and neither did he. Then he said, "Was that good?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Okay." And I heard in that one word the thing underneath it, the slow release of something he had been carrying since Tuesday, or maybe before Tuesday, maybe since the first day in the dark when he had looked at the situation and made the choice he always made without knowing it was a choice. I looked at my hands. I had been folding and unfolding the corner of the formal presentation document since the moment the room emptied. I had folded it 9 times. I counted. Cale did not comment on this. He was becoming, I thought, quite fluent in me. The reception was the next morning. They had built it overnight, the way the palace built everything, completely, correctly, with no visible evidence of the effort. The great secondary hall was dressed in Thessari formal colors, and the household guard was in full presentation armor, and there were 70 people where the day before there had been 53. Because word travels through a palace faster than sound, and everyone wanted to see the human on a day when the outcome was already known to be ceremonial rather than uncertain. Cale arrived in his jacket. The jacket had, I was fairly sure, been offered alternatives. I was also fairly sure that the alternatives had been declined with the particular politeness that meant no, genuinely, I appreciate it, but no. The jacket was the jacket. It was part of him, the way his boots were part of him, and his hands and pockets were part of him, the whole assembly of it constituting a person who was exactly one thing and had decided that was enough. He found me in the room by walking toward me, which was not protocol but was also, at this point, not unexpected. "Hey," he said. "Hello," I said. He looked at the room, the decorations, the assembly of people in formal dress. "This is a lot," he said. "You are being given a designation and passage home. For us, these are ceremonial events." "What's the designation?" I had rehearsed this. The Thessari Administrative Office has created a title. It translates approximately as the one who stays. Cale was quiet for a moment. "That's a lot of words for I don't leave people," he said. "We tend toward the formal." "Yeah, I noticed." He looked at his jacket, smoothed a wrinkle that was not quite smoothable. "Do I have to do anything for the ceremony?" "Accept the title. Stand in the correct position. Try not to apologize to the furniture." He looked at me. His mouth did the thing that was not quite a smile but was in the same family. "I make no promises," he said. The ceremony proceeded. The senior court official announced the designation in High Thessari and then in human English, because my mother had given that instruction, and my mother's instructions were followed without discussion. Kale stood in the correct position, which he had been shown once and had remembered exactly. When the title was formally given, the official asked the traditional question, "Does the recipient acknowledge the designation?" Kale said, "I don't know what that means, but okay." Someone in the back of the room made a sound, a very small sound. It might have been a laugh. In the 30 years of formal Thessari court ceremonies I had witnessed in my life, I had never heard anything that might have been a laugh. I looked for the source and could not find it. The faces were all correct. The passage documentation was presented. The escort assignments were read. A safe corridor through 3 sectors, Thessari flag on the transit vessel, priority clearance at every checkpoint. Kale looked at the documentation. "This is a lot of clearance for one guy and a transit ship," he said to me quietly. "My mother does not do things partially," I said. He nodded. "Yeah, I'm getting that." The ceremony finished. People began to move. The formal assembly dissolved into the kind of standing around that follows ceremonies in every culture I have ever studied. The moment when the structure ends and no one is quite sure how to leave, and people find small conversations to have until someone makes the first move toward the door. Kale stood beside me, and we did not say anything for a moment. I had rehearsed this part 11 times. I know because I counted. I had rehearsed what I would say and how I would stand and what expression I would hold, because the Thessari do not cry, and I was a princess, and I was my mother's daughter, and I had been trained for 23 years in the correct way to close a ceremony. I said, "You will have everything you need for the transit." "Yeah," he said, "looks like. The escort will follow your vessel to the border of human map space. After that, you'll have Thessari clearance documentation in case you encounter any registered fleet." That's really more than I expected. "Kale." He looked at me. "This is my friend." I had not planned to say it like that. I had planned something more formal, something with the appropriate Thessari register for a person of significance, a word that would carry the weight correctly and still be the right shape for a court reception. But I looked at him, and I said it in his language, in plain human English, in front of 70 people who did not have a word for it. And the word landed in the room like something being set down after a very long time of being carried. The room went still. Not the trained stillness of ceremony. The held-breath stillness of 70 people encountering a word they had no shelf for. Kale went still too. Not his casual not-quite stillness, not the hands-in-pockets patience of a man who was comfortable taking up his exact amount of space and no more. This was different. This was the stillness of a person who had just been given something and was holding very carefully so he did not drop it. He said, "Yeah." That was all. Just yeah. In the human register I had been building for 17 days, yeah meant, "I heard you." Yeah meant, "It is true." Yeah meant, "I am not going to make this into a speech because neither of us does well with speeches, and the thing is already said and the room already knows." He left 3 hours later. I walked him to the transit bay, just the 2 of us, which was not protocol, but I had decided, privately and completely, that I was done adjusting myself to the correct distance from this particular person. The escort vessel was already running. 2 Thessari pilots, full clearance loaded, the flag on the hull. Kale stood at the base of the boarding ramp and looked at it for a moment. Then he turned around. He said, "You'll be okay." Not a question, not a comfort offered from uncertainty. He said it the way you say something you need to be true, and you need it to be true so completely that you put the statement into the world as a fact rather than a hope, because that is the only way you know how to hold it. I said yes. He looked at me for 3 more seconds. Then he went up the ramp. The bay doors closed. The escort vessel ran its departure sequence. I stood at the observation window and watched it clear the bay and enter the transit corridor and reduce to a point of light, and then to nothing at all. I stood there for a while. My hands were in front of me, and I had the edge of my formal robe between my fingers, and I was folding it and unfolding it, and I counted, because I always count, 14 times. My mother found me there an hour later, still at the window, the transit corridor long empty. She stood beside me and did not speak for a moment. Then she said, "Did you cry?" The Thessari do not cry. This is not a rule. It is a truth about our physiology and our emotional architecture, the same way that my mother does not ask questions she does not already know the answer to. I said no. She looked at my hands. I had the robe between my fingers. I was still folding it. She looked at the empty corridor outside the window. She did not ask again. She stood beside me at the window for 7 minutes, which I know because I counted, and she did not speak, and I did not speak, and outside the window there was nothing to see, just the map dark and the transit lane and 30 star systems of empire that had no word for what I was holding. I kept folding the robe. That was the only answer she needed.